All right. Hi, guys. Welcome to the virtual lecture class. Last time last week we finished talking about Maslow, the first humanistic psychologist. Now today we're going to pick up with talking about Carl Rogers. So he was also part of the humanistic movement. Carl Rogers was a therapist who worked in with college students. So he worked with really highly functioning, generally kind of mentally healthy, young, really self motivated individuals who just had, some issues with adjusting to college life or maybe some mild anxiety or depression. So he really didn't see much of kind of severe psychopathology. Based on his work, he developed what became known as client centered therapy approach, which I'll talk about here in a second. But essentially, and kind of through his work with students, he came to really emphasize this self actualization. So, similar to Maslow, this idea of reaching our highest potential. And he believed that we, as human beings, we naturally seek to kind of reach our highest potential. We don't need any kind of extra motivations for that. If provided with correct kind of circumstances, we will work ourselves to reach our highest potential and to self actualize. And he believed that what is really important in order for us to self actualize and to reach our highest potential is we need a positive regard. And we really, that's kind of our highest need. So, kind of similar to Maslow's idea of all these different needs that need to be met before we can self actualize, Rogers emphasized really just one need, a need for positive regard. And this is essentially the need to be accepted and loved by others for who we are. So, for somebody to just love us without any kind of conditions, or just for who we are. We don't have to pretend anything. We don't have to try to be somebody else, but for somebody to just accept us kind of unconditionally. In developing his theory, Rogers developed this idea of conditions of worth. And he said that these conditions develop through our interactions with our parents while we're growing up as children. So essentially, we are communicated by our parents that we're good and we're loved by our parents only under certain conditions. So these conditions of worth. For example, a lot of us get this message from parents that we're good when we get good grades in school, right? And kind of the implied sort of meaning is that we're bad if we're not getting good grades, right? If we got an F, we're bad. And the kind of the conclusion that a child might come to is that we're not loved unless we do these things, right? Unless we are polite, unless we're nice and quiet and well behaved, unless we share toys with our sisters or brothers, or get good grades, or are nice to strangers out on the street. So all of these different conditions that our parents kind of, without meaning to, they, most parents don't mean to communicate that, oh, I don't love you if you don't meet these conditions. But according to Rogers, this is what children internalize, that I have to be this certain way in order to be loved. And so what happens is that over time we change ourselves to kind of live up to others' conditions of worth, right? So we do things that we think will give us other people's love and acceptance. And these things don't always kind of go along our own idea of kind of what we need, our own kind of path towards self actualization, right? So maybe my parent thinks that I really need to become a doctor, right? And in order to please my parent and to kind of earn their acceptance and their approval and their love, I'm going to go and become a doctor. But really, I wanted to become an artist. And that, like, I would have self actualized if I became an artist. But now I have not perceived that path. And so I'm not going to self actualize as a doctor because that's not my thing. That's not really what I'm internally, kind of my true internal self is not kind of aiming for that, is not meant for that. So the idea is that the more kind of conditional the love of our parents is as we grow up, the more likely we will develop problems as adults, because we kind of have stepped away from our own path towards self actualization and improving ourselves. And now we're living our life kind of to please others. And so internally, we feel that, we're not doing the right thing. We're not kind of doing what we really want to be doing. And so that contributes to development of anxiety and kind of depression and, some other kind of personality problems. Um, which kind of makes sense, right? If you think about it, if you think about your own lives, even, I mean, depending on kind of how your parents were growing up, but for a lot of us, right, parents send us messages about what we should and shouldn't be doing. And we want to please our parents. Most of us really want to. And we oftentimes do things just to please our parents, not because we ourselves really want to do these things. And so Rogers believed that kind of a way to treat somebody, a way to, if somebody has developed these conditions of worth, a way out is to treat somebody with an unconditional positive regard. So, this is what his client centered therapy was all about. He would express this unconditional, right, acceptance and approval towards his patients. So no matter what you choose to do, I love you and I accept you for who you are as a human being, right? And he believes that throughout therapy, right, as kind of clients receive this unconditional positive regard, they will be able to find their own path towards self-actualization and to feel kind of the courage to pursue their own goals and dreams as opposed to living for somebody else's goals and dreams. So, kind of his theory was criticized because it was not research based. It was based on his own experiences. And as you have seen, his experiences were limited to a relatively healthy and kind of high functioning population. So, his approach is not really applicable to a lot of other kind of lower functioning populations or some other kind of circumstances in life. But his theory had a major application in therapy. And in fact, a lot of therapy approaches these days have Rogers' client centered approach as its basis. We find that it really is kind of necessary for successful therapy. So he's kind of better known in psychotherapy circles, and has kind of his theory has more value there, as opposed to, in kind of understanding human personality development, or, in any kind of other kind of empirical research circles. Um, all right, so that's that for humanistic therapies. So now moving on to, so we've talked about Freud, right, and neo-Freudian approach, and then we talked about humanistic approach to personality. And so this next section we'll talk about social cognitive approach to personality, which emphasizes the importance of social learning, right? Remember we talked about Bandura, about modeling, right? So the idea is that kind of our personality develops through our learning, kind of the modeling, right, that we receive from others in our environment. Kind of we see other people behave in a certain way, and we, start kind of emulating these people. And then also our cognitive processes are really crucial to our personality development, right? Um, so let's see. The first one is Bandura's self system. So the self system is the set of kind of cognitive processes by which we all kind of observe our own behavior and kind of evaluate it and then adjust it, regulate it, kind of in whichever way we find necessary. So the behavior that defines one's personality is a product of a person's self system, right? And so the social learning theory that Bandura developed illustrates how this self system works. So children observe various behaviors of models in their environment, right? And then they choose which behaviors to imitate based on whether or not those behaviors were rewarded or punished. Remember that children are more likely to imitate the behaviors that they saw being rewarded, and they're much less likely to imitate a behavior that was punished in front of them, right? And so once they imitate these behaviors, then they themselves will either receive rewards or punishments of some sort for this behavior. And so if the behaviors continue to be reinforced, if they get rewarded for behaving in this way, then these individuals will incorporate these behaviors into their personality. So the idea is that really there's the self-direction, right? We're not kind of victims of our past, like Freud would say, right? We're not victims of just our childhood and kind of unresolved conflicts from there. We're not just victims of our environment, like behaviorists claimed, but we choose our behavior based on our expectations of reinforcement and punishment. And then that behavior kind of gets incorporated in our personality depending on consequences that we receive kind of going forward. So, as people kind of behave in these ways that they have been reinforced to behave, they then observe their own behavior and they judge its effectiveness kind of in dealing with particular situations according to their own kind of standards of what they consider to be effective or not. So these observations really impact our sense of self-efficacy. And self-efficacy, I think we talked about self-efficacy already, right? So it's kind of how effective do you feel like you are with dealing with particular situations, whether or not you feel like you can do something, right? And so self-efficacy really plays a major role in determining our behavior, right? The basic principle behind kind of the self-efficacy theory is that people are more likely to engage in behaviors for which they have high self-efficacy. So that makes sense. I'm more likely to behave to behave kind of in ways that I feel like I can do something, right? And people are much less likely to engage in behaviors for which they don't feel high self efficacy. So if I don't feel like I can do something, I'm much less likely to try doing that. And that is therefore much less likely to be incorporated into my personality, right? So there's kind of this bidirectional relationship between my personality and my behavior, right? And the more I kind of behave in certain ways, the more I incorporate it into my personality and kind of feel like that's the kind of person I am. And then the more I feel like that's part of my personality, the more likely I am to behave in that way later on. Another theorist in this group was Rotter, and so his locus of control is kind of a well-known concept. You may or may not have heard about that before. So locus means place. So there are kind of the idea is that there are two places of control, right? So locus of control is a person's perception of kind of the extent to which he or she controls kind of what happens, right? Whether or not I feel in control of my own fate. So external locus of control means that I don't feel in control, right? I feel like there's kind of fate controls or God or maybe other people. I feel like things are out of my control. I cannot affect how my life is going to turn out, right? I don't have much choice. I don't have much say in what happens to me, right? And of course, there are things that we don't have much say in whether or not that happens to us, right? And some things we all probably do have control over. But people with really kind of extreme external locus of control, they feel like nothing is in their control. And then there are people on the other end of the continuum with internal locus of control. And these people believe that they control their own fate, that, it's in their hands one way or another. They're the ones who make the choices. They're the ones who are responsible, right? And in terms of your psychological well being, it's better, it's healthier to have an internal locus of control. Um, and because when you feel in control, you feel kind of better about your life, right? It doesn't feel good to not feel in control. And you're probably going to take more responsibility and more actions towards actually meeting your goals, right? If you believe that it is in your control, then you are going to take necessary steps, right, to achieve your goals, to make sure that certain things do or do not happen in your life, like even things like getting sick, for example, right? If you feel like it's in your control, then you're more likely to exercise and eat healthy and kind of avoid known kind of health hazards, right? If you don't feel like it's in your control, if you have this external locus of control, then you are less likely to try something because, right, why bother? It's out of my control. What can I do? Um, so in extreme cases, external locus of control can lead to what we know as learned helplessness. So it's kind of this sense of hopelessness where people think that they can't prevent kind of negative things from happening to them. Learned helplessness oftentimes um, is observed in depressed people and people who live in poverty and kind of people who sort of were so beat up by life, that they no longer try. They have learned from their experiences that no matter what they try, bad things are still going to happen to them. And so, that obviously leads to depression and all sorts of other negative consequences. So, um, the locus of control is another kind of important um, part of our personality, right? What kind of person you are. Um, and then lastly, we kind of how we deal with these poor outcomes, right? Because not all of us develop learned helplessness. So, how do people kind of maintain their psychological health and their kind of positive self perception in the face of negative circumstances and negative events that happen? While attribution theory helps explain kind of how we maintain this positive perception and positive attitude in the face of kind of unpleasant events that happen in everybody's life. So attributions are explanations we have for our success and different kind of interpretations of why you may have failed a test or explaining why maybe your partner broke up with you or explaining to yourself why you got sick. So attributions are interpretations. So that means that it's not kind of necessarily an objective truth. It's what you make out of the situation. What is it that you think personally contributed to the event that happened? Why do you think you failed a test, right? And we make all sorts of different attributions. Different people make different explanations for their successes and failures, right? And there are three different ways in which attributions differ. So first, attributions can be internal or external, right? So an internal attribution means that you're explaining to yourself with our example, for example, okay, so say for example, you failed a test, right? How are you going to explain it to yourself? Different people explain the same event differently. So if you make an internal attribution, then you explain to yourself that you failed a test because of something that's kind of inherently inside of you. That's kind of your part in it, right? For example, I didn't know the material. I didn't study hard enough, right? That's an internal attribution because that was up to you, right? That's an internal kind of factor. An external attribution would be something that wasn't up to you, right? For example, I failed this test because I was distracted by the noise outside, right? There was a construction outside the classroom, and that really kind of threw me off, and I couldn't think through all that loud noise. And so that's why I didn't do as well, right? So, kind of same event, but you explain it in very different ways to yourself. And as you might imagine, depending on how you explain it to yourself, you may feel differently about how you failed the test. So another type of attribution can be stable versus unstable, right? So how kind of this explanation, how likely is it to kind of come up again, right? For example, if you explain to yourself that you failed a test because you're stupid and you just cannot study for tests and you just don't get it, you're just not good at tests, that's a pretty stable explanation, right? That is likely not going to change for your next exam, right? If you really believe that you're stupid, that's probably not going to that's not likely to really shift much over time. You're probably stuck with that explanation for yourself, and you're probably going to make that explanation for everything, right? As opposed to unstable attribution, maybe like I didn't get enough sleep for the exam, right? So that's an unstable thing. That's something that you can change next time, right? Like get more sleep, and then you're good to go, right? So if you have explained to yourself that you failed a test because you're stupid, then you're likely to feel much worse about yourself, right? After getting that F, as opposed to if you explain it to yourself, oh, I just didn't get enough sleep, then all you have to do is, oh, okay, I'll get more sleep next time and I'll be good. And you're probably not going to feel as bad about yourself for failing the test. A third type of attributions is controllable versus uncontrollable. So, a controllable attribution explanation is something that's within your control, right? For example, I didn't study enough for this test. That's in your control, right? So again, you're probably going to feel better about it because you can just tell yourself, well, I'm going to study harder next time and I'm going to do better, right? Um, versus uncontrollable attribution is obviously something that's outside of your control. So, for example, you could say to yourself, oh, I failed this exam because my teacher really gives unreasonably difficult tests. Well, that's not in your control, right? So if you have that explanation for yourself, then you're pretty much screwed for the entire class, right? Because the next test is probably going to be as unreasonably difficult as the first one. These attributions, it's not kind of either or in terms of these kind of internal, stable, or controllable, but it's all three of those are descriptors of the same attribution, right? So, for example, I failed the test because I didn't study enough. That would be an internal attribution. That is also an unstable attribution, right? Because you can study harder next time. And it is a controllable attribution, right? So those three are all three kind of adjectives can describe the same attribution, right? Um, let's see. So then there is a self-serving bias. So that's a tendency to make attributions that allow us to perceive ourselves positively. And most healthy people have this self serving bias. So essentially, if the outcome of an event is positive, then we tend to take credit for it, right? We tend to feel like, oh, that's an internal, that's kind of an internal. We make an internal attribution. Oh, I aced this test. I got an A on it because I'm so smart, right? We tend to make kind of internal attributions for things that we did well. However, if we didn't do well, then we tend to kind of blame something else and have an external attribution, right? Oh, I failed this test because the teacher is unfair, right? Most of us will make that kind of attribution as opposed to thinking, oh, that's because I'm stupid, right? Um, so this self-serving bias is really adaptive, right? It preserves our self-esteem because right? Like it's um, we're gonna try harder next time on a test if we believed that it was something out of our control that prevented us from doing well on this test, right? If you think that you're stupid, then I mean, you're not going to do much about it, right? You're probably not going to study much for the next test either, and that's not very adaptive, right? You're not going to survive very well like that. So this is really important for humans to have. And in fact, we know that depressed people don't have this self serving bias. And they tend to interpret kind of all the good things that happen to them. They feel like, oh, that was just chance. That was just them being nice. That's not about me. Or I just got lucky on this test. The teacher didn't ask all the difficult questions, right? But then if something bad happens, like, oh, I failed this test, that's because I'm stupid. So you see how they kind of flip flop the same events to explain them in the least kind of positive way. And that, of course, kind of they get into the cycle, right? They get stuck in this negative explanation of events. And of course, when you start explaining things in that way, it's harder to get out of that depressed state, right? So, which attributions are the best? Which ones lead to most success? Well, probably as you have guessed, um, the best attributions are internal and controllable, right? So it's important for you to kind of explain things to yourself in a way that feels kind of under your control, right? Similar to the internal locus of control that we just talked about. Because if you feel like it's in your control, then you can do something about it next time, right? If you feel like it's not in your control, then I mean, that's it. That's the end of it. There's nothing that can be done. So I promised you guys an extra credit opportunity. So there will be two throughout this lecture. So the first one is involves practice making attributions. So what I want you to do is open up a Word document. Right now, right before moving on to the next part of this lecture, um, practice making attributions for these following scenarios, right? So first, imagine that you received a high score on your MCAT. What would be an internal attribution that you can make? What would be an external attribution that you can make? Right? What would be the stable versus an unstable? What would be controllable versus uncontrollable? Right? So I want you to write 6 possible attributions for an MCAT, for kind of receiving a high score in MCAT, um, and explain to me which attribution kind of, which one is internal, which one is stable. You get the point. And then for another part, think about being ridiculed by your attending physician for incorrectly answering a question. So what kind of attributions could you make for that event? And again, make 6 attributions, and one of them being internal versus external, stable versus unstable, controllable versus uncontrollable. So write all of those out for me, and post them. I'll make on a discussion board on Blackboard. I will open up a discussion topic for extra credit, and so you can submit your responses in there. I think you can either copy and paste into Blackboard, or you can just upload a Word document, whichever one it is. But so go ahead and pause me now if you're going to take that extra credit opportunity, and I'll give you 5 extra credit points for this one, and then there's another 5 extra credit points coming up further in this lecture. So that will, if you choose to do both, that will give you 10 extra credit points, which is 20% of your exam score. So that's, that could really make a difference on your 3rd exam, or maybe if you were unhappy with your 2nd exam score, that can help you out. So go ahead and hit pause now if you're going to do this, and work through these attributions, and then come back and finish up this lecture. So for those of you who choose to not do the extra credit, or if you came back from doing it, hi again. So now we're going to move on to our last kind of personality theory, and these are trait theories of personality. So what are kind of personality traits? These are internally based, relatively stable characteristics that define an individual's personality, right? So each personality trait is a dimension, right? It's a continuum ranging from one extreme of the dimension to the other, right? So people vary from each other along each of these continuums. Along each of these traits, people fall in different kind of continuum for each of these traits. For example, how sociable you are, right? Some of us are more sociable, some of us are less sociable, or maybe kind of how kind you are, right? Some of us are much more kind of seem to be much more empathetic and kind than others, or how responsible you are, right? So a person's personality stems from the amount of each trait that he has, or he or she has, right? So where you fall on a continuum for each of these different traits, all of this kind of sums up into your personality, right? And so there are thousands and thousands of adjectives, as you might imagine, to describe a person, right? But they're not all necessary to understand one's personality. So this is what trait theorists are all about, right? They strive to discover how many and exactly which ones of all of these different adjectives, all of these different personality traits, which ones can adequately capture somebody's personality, right? What is kind of the sufficient number of traits to really describe somebody well, to understand what they're all about? So trait theorists use factor analysis to kind of identify these clusters of test items, for example, in a personality test, that measure the same trait, right? So different kind of statements, different adjectives may all come together to measure kind of the same thing ultimately. For example, a test item, I see myself as somebody who's full of energy, and a test item, I see myself as somebody who's outgoing and sociable, right? They may sound different, those are different adjectives, but they both refer to the same overall trait of extroversion, right? Being energetic and being outgoing and sociable. So this is what I mean by, right? So that would be kind of a factor, right? Extroversion. And that captures within itself all of these different variety of adjectives that might describe somebody who's an extrovert. Um, so different theorists came up with different number of these kind of basic personality traits, and we will only discuss two theorists because they're kind of most well known. So our first theorist is Hans Eysenck, and he proposed that there are only three traits, only three out of all these thousands of adjectives. He said it all can boil down to three traits that are sufficient to describe somebody's personality. And more than that, he said that these three traits can be determined by heredity. So there are kind of biological basis to our personality. So our personality can be explained by our biological, kind of inheritable, physical aspects of our body. So the first of the three factors of personality that he described is extroversion versus introversion, right? So it's one trait, and again, remember it's a continuum, right? So on one end of the continuum, you are an introvert. On the other end of the continuum, you're an extrovert. Most of us probably fall somewhere in the middle, right? There's a little bit of introvert in all of us, and there's a little bit of an extrovert in all of us. Um, so obviously, we all know what extroversion and introversion is, right? How sociable you are. So the biological basis for an extroversion or introversion, according to Eysenck, is a level of cortical arousal, right? So the amount of neuronal activity. So an introvert has a higher normal levels of arousal than an extrovert. So in other words, introvert's brain are more active, right? And an extrovert, therefore, needs to kind of seek external stimulation, right, to reach that same level of arousal that we all kind of. The idea is that there's this optimal level of arousal that we all want to get to, and introverts already kind of are there naturally. Their brain naturally produces that amount of arousal, while extroverts have lower levels of arousal to begin with in their brain, and so they're striving to kind of raise their arousal level, and that's why they seek all of these kind of activities and engaging socially with others, and trying to um, kind of be more outgoing and sociable. So they're seeking this external stimulation, which kind of makes sense, right, if you think about it. So the other two factors that he proposed, the second factor is the neuroticism versus emotional stability. So again, on one end of the continuum, you're really calm and emotionally stable and kind of not easily flustered. And on the other, you are kind of this neurotic person, right? You're tense, you're anxious, you're easily kind of frustrated, easily flustered, you kind of easily lose your cool. And he said that the biological basis for this factor would be the difference in sympathetic nervous system, right? So individuals high on neuroticism have more reactive sympathetic system. So recall that the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for body arousal, right? For getting us into fight or flight mode. So the idea is that folks higher on their neuroticism trait more easily get into this fight or flight response, right? No matter what, something happens and their system all of a sudden is overactive, right? Versus emotionally stable people have a more kind of less reactive system, and so it takes more for them to kind of snap into this fight or flight mode. And then the third factor is psychoticism versus impulse control. And so this factor determines how aggressive, how impulsive, and how antisocial a person is, right? So on one continuum, you are this kind of psychotic, aggressive, maybe like a psychopath, and on the other end, kind of extreme, you are under kind of, you have this incredible control, right? You control your impulses very well. You don't get aggressive, right? Even if you feel aggression, um, you don't kind of you have sort of a tight lid on, right? So the biological basis for this factor would be your level of testosterone and MAO, the inhibitor neurotransmitter, right? So individuals who are high on psychoticism have this high level of testosterone, and they have low levels of the inhibitor, right? So they have a hard time kind of controlling themselves. So research actually does support these biological bases for these three personality traits. So Eysenck really was onto something when he talked about biological basis for personality. They're really, and we know that personality really is hereditary, at least to some extent. Obviously, environmental factors also influence our personality. But his three factors were a bit too kind of narrow, right? It's not quite enough to capture somebody's personality. So a better theory, kind of a better model to capture somebody's personality more adequately, is known as a five-factor model of personality, and this is the most well-known, the most researched, the most kind of famous and accepted model of personality in the field right now. So this is it. This is what researchers have agreed on. So they've agreed that there's five factors that can adequately describe and capture our personality. And these five factors include openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. These kind of, if you take the first letter of each of the factors, they make up the word ocean. So that can help you remember kind of the five factors, right? A little mnemonic for you. So what are these factors? So openness is our level of interest for new experiences. Kind of how open to new ideas you are, how imaginative and creative you are, right? So somebody high on openness is going to be very interested in new experiences, new people, reading new books, trying out new things, new foods, right? Like kind of open-minded person. Somebody low in the openness would be very kind of conservative, right? So they're not very interested in trying new things. They're not very kind of easily kind of persuaded to try or kind of to be open-minded towards new ideas. Conscientiousness is how organized and responsible and self-disciplined and dependable you are, right? So somebody high on conscientiousness is going to be very organized, very kind of um, um, meticulous and kind of neat, and will be kind of on time, as a self-starter, can kind of sit in the office and work on their own. They have high discipline, right? And somebody low in conscientiousness is sort of really sloppy and messy, and this is the kind of person who's kind of always late, loses things, right? You can't really rely on that person very well. Extroversion is again kind of extroversion versus introversion, right? So this one state, this is similar to Ising's introversion versus extroversion factor. So again, this is kind of how social and outgoing you are, right? How talkative, how friendly, how adventurous, how energetic you are. Um, Agreeableness, our fourth factor, is how easygoing you are, how sympathetic, how polite, how kind of good natured and soft hearted you are. So, somebody high on agreeableness is going to be very kind, very kind of helpful, very caring and empathetic and sympathetic. And somebody who's low on agreeableness is not going to be very kind of pro social and is not going to be kind of, won't seem very kind of nice, right? And then finally, the neuroticism, the fifth personality factor, is our tendency to experience negative emotions, right? So things like depression, anxiety, self criticism. So somebody high on neuroticism is going to be kind of insecure, nervous, prone to self pity, prone to kind of these anxious and depressed thoughts. And somebody low on neuroticism is going to be more kind of stable and calm and self confident and generally kind of happy and easygoing, right? So these five factors appear to be universal, right? They have been extracted in various cultures and genders and different ages, and we do know that they have about a 50% heritability rate across different cultures. So there is a genetic base to these, kind of similar again to what Ising was proposing. And there are several assessment instruments to measure these five personality factors. Um, then NEO-PIR and NEO-PI3 and NEO-FFI. They just are different length of assessments. So some of these are shorter for kind of purposes of research, or if you have limited time, and then the other ones are more kind of expanded if you want kind of more detailed report. Um, but let's see. So yeah, so these are the five factors, and here I have a little kind of table for you guys in case if you haven't caught kind of some of the descriptions that I gave for each of the traits. So you can use that for your studying. purposes. Okay, so now we're coming to the second part of the extra credit. So for another 5 points, so 10 points total if you did that previous extra credit activity with attributions. Um, this is two part activity, right? So for the next two slides. So for the first part, I'm going to show you a video clip. So those of you who choose not to do the extra credit, you can kind of fast forward and move on to the next slide. Um, but for those of you who want to do the activity, I'm going to show you a really quick video clip. It's like less than a minute. And again, in your Word document, I want you to um, answer these questions essentially, right? So, what can you say about this character's personality? What would you consider to be this character's most noticeable positive and negative traits? And where would this character fall on each of the 5 dimensions of the five-factor model, right? So how would you say that she's high on neuroticism or low? Would you say that she's high on conscientiousness or no or low, and so on? And then to what extent are the character's traits consistent across situations? So I think most of you are probably familiar with this character, so you can answer that question. If not, just kind of take a guess to what you think. So here's the video clip.
Guardian Leviosa. Stop. You're going to take someone's eye out. Besides, you're saying it wrong. It's Leviosa, not Leviosa. You do it then if you're so clever. Go on. Guardian Leviosa. Wingardium Leviosa.
Oh, well done. See here, everyone. Miss Granger's done it. Splendid.
Okay. So, as you probably figured out, Hermione is the character, right? So, answer these questions. So, pause this and go ahead and answer these questions about the video. So, the next part of the extra credit activity for these 5 points, I want you to take this short test. And this is like a really quick and dirty assessment of the 5 personality um, factors, right? So this will tell you kind of where you are at in terms of these 5 factors. So there's 10 questions, as you can see. So you want to answer whether you agree or disagree with each of these statements. And then go ahead and score your responses based on the instructions on the bottom here. So go ahead and take this test and write down your results, right? So what kind of where you're at, right? What are your 5 personality factors, where you fall on those, and write whether kind of what you agree with. Do you agree with these, or which ones kind of were surprising to you, or maybe you don't agree with those? Okay, so do you agree with these, and which ones, if any, were surprising to you, and why? Okay, so go ahead to write, and so go ahead and take a moment to answer this and score yourself, and then write up your responses. And So, if you did all of the extra credit, that should give you 10 extra credit points. And we're going to move on. So this is a summary of different theoretical approaches that we've covered between today and previous lecture. So you can just use this for your studying purposes. And we are now going to move on to the last part of this lecture, which discusses how to assess somebody's personality, right? So personality assessments. So the primary uses for personality tests, why you would want to assess somebody's personality, they help in diagnosing people with problems. So in things like counseling or social work, right? It can help us in understanding what somebody's personality is, to help understand why they behave in a certain way, or why they might For example, why are you always anxious, right? Oh, I'm high on neuroticism. That's just part of my personality, right? So that can help you kind of feel less bad about yourself being always anxious, for example, right? Or we could use it in research, right? What kind of personality traits lead to greatest success in this field of work, for example, right? Um, and also making personnel decisions, right? You want somebody, probably when you're hiring somebody for a job, you want somebody who's maybe open-minded, maybe really responsible and conscientious, maybe low in neuroticism, right? So if you give them a personality test, it can help you in making a decision of whether or not this person would be a good fit at your work environment. There are primarily two types of personality assessments. So there are personality inventories, so kind of the tests like the one that you just took for an extra credit. Um, and then there are projective tests, and we're going to talk about those here in a second. So first, personality assessments or personality inventories. So these are designed to measure multiple traits of personality and sometimes even personality disorders. So these typically include series of questions or statements, again, like the one that you saw in the example if you did the extra credit, for which the test taker must kind of indicate whether or not they agree with the statement. So it's usually kind of a true, false, agree, disagree type of answers. Um, and personality tests, these inventories tend to, ask about different specific behaviors or attitudes or values or beliefs, right? Like, for example, I'm somebody who's very sociable, or I really like to cook, or I really enjoy interacting with people, right? So these kinds of statements. So the most famous, well-known personality inventory is known as MMPI-2, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And 2 means that it's a second revision. So there was an original one, and then they made some changes to it, and so now it's a second version. Let's see. The MMPI uses the true, false, cannot say format, right? So you have three options to answer two statements. And it has 567 simple statements, right? I like to cook, for example. True or false? Or I can't say, right? For whatever reason. So it's quite a lot of questions, but because they're simple, it goes pretty quickly. So it takes about an hour to an hour and a half to complete, which is still, a considerable amount of time. So it's not something that can be just quickly, easily done, like administered to anybody. Um, so the purpose of MMPI is to really measure abnormal personality. So it has 10 clinical scales, including things like depression, schizophrenia, OCD, psychopathology, kind of how feminine or masculine you are. So the way that this test was designed, developed, was they gave a bunch of items to kind of normal, sort of healthy, mentally adjusted people. And then they gave the same items to people with different disorders. And then they looked at which items people consistently answered differently, right? So it didn't really matter what an item was. For example, I like to cook, right? Maybe depressed people consistently answered no, and kind of normal people consistently answered yes. And so then they use this item to distinguish somebody. So then if I take this test and I answer yes on I like to cook, then that means that I'm probably kind of have a normal personality. And if I say no, then that means that I'm depressed. This is really roughly speaking. Of course, it's much more complicated than that. There's 567 such statements. So it's not as kind of straightforward as that, but that's kind of the basic idea, right? So these tests or these items on this test were really meant to distinguish between healthy and unhealthy people. And the personality assessment also contains 3 validity scales, right? So the idea is that kind of the assumption when people take this test is that a person can and will provide accurate information, right? Which of course is a major limitation, right? Oftentimes people take these tests and they want to either appear good, like healthy, or maybe they want to appear unhealthy, right? For example, in forensic testing, right? If you can claim insanity, then you get out of jail, right? So people have high incentive to lie and kind of pretend to be worse off than maybe they really are. Or, if you really don't want to go into a mental institution, but, maybe you really do have problems, then you might try to kind of fake good and pretend like you're better off than you really are. So these validity scales are the tests attempt to catch such kind of false attempts to kind of cheat on the test, right? To pretend to be something that you're not. Um, so these validity scales try to detect kind of these test takers who are trying to cover up problems or fake profiles. So, for example, it can be um, an item says, "I get angry sometimes," right? And people who are truthful, they probably will answer yes, because all of us obviously get angry sometimes, right? But if you were trying to kind of see more healthy and more kind of psychologically adjusted, then I might say, no, 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 I don't get angry, right? Because I don't want to seem like I have problems. And so then this test kind of will ding kind of those kinds of answers and will give you kind of a summative response, kind of a summative scale that will say, oh, that seems like this person was faking. Um, it's kind of a complicated system, so I'm not going to go into details. It's not quite as simple as whether or not you answered yes or no on certain questions, but that's kind of the principle of how it works. So this test generally has a good validity and good reliability. So it's considered a really kind of good, stable test that really does capture a lot of these problems for people. So it is widely used in various settings. So this is our example of a personality inventory. So there are different types of tests like this, but again, MMPI is the most kind of widely known and used one. And then another type of personality assessment is projective tests. And so projective tests, they contain a series of ambiguous stimuli. So like a famous Rorschach ink blots. I'm sure you guys, most of you have heard about these. If not, we're going to talk about them here in a second. So these ambiguous stimuli, a test taker have to respond about his or her perception of the stimuli, right? So the difference here is that there's no objective kind of correct answer, right? Instead, the test giver is interested in kind of what parts of personality or what types of inner conflicts a person is going to project onto these ambiguous stimuli. So, this kind of follows the idea. Remember when we talked about Freud and his defense mechanisms of projection, right? So the idea behind this is that people kind of, they carry their own stuff, and then whenever they see something ambiguous, they're going to kind of interpret it in accordance with their own kind of issues and problems, right? If I'm thinking about cheating on my husband, right, I'm going to see something about cheaters everywhere, right? And so if I get this ambiguous stimulus, I might say, oh, this is a picture of somebody cheating on their wife, right? Roughly speaking. Again, it's not quite as simple as that, but kind of to give you an idea, right? So the two tests that we're going to talk about, and there are more projective tests out there, but these are the most famous, well-known ones. So there's Rorschach ink blots test, and then there's thematic apperception tests, also known as TAT. So the Rorschach ink blot test contains 10 symmetric ink blots that are used in a test, like the one that you see on the right here is an example. So the examiner then kind of shows these ink blots to the person and asks the test taker to kind of say, what do you see, right? And then they go back through these pictures and they ask to kind of clarify their responses, kind of to give more details. Oh, what do you think this part is? What's this red thing over here, right? What is this part? And kind of why did you think, kind of what made you think of this, right? So again, kind of the idea is that the person's kind of personality gets projected into their responses. So again, there's no kind of corrective or correct objective meaning of this image, right? So this image to the right, there's no kind of right answer. This is not a specific picture of something. This really is just kind of a blob, right? And different people will interpret it a little bit differently. There is some research that shows that most healthy people kind of answer this way, and then people with depression tend to see this thing, and people with psychosis, like people with schizophrenia, for example, tend to see this. But really, there's not much research supporting this. So it's not really considered to be very reliable and valid. Um, and the responses must be interpreted by the scorer, which of course leaves much room for bias and for error. So it's not the most kind of scientific test out there by far, but it is widely used in therapy, kind of in those who believe in psychoanalysis and interpretations and projection. Um, they widely use this test and kind of get their own ideas about the test taker's personality. And then the second projective test is TAT. So TAT consists of 31 cards with black and white pictures of kind of this ambiguous setting, right? So you can see an example of a card here to the right, right? So it's not quite clear, right, what's going on in the picture just by looking at it. So it's an ambiguous stimulus. And so there are 31 cards, but a test giver only chooses about 10 cards to use in an individual testing session. And they give this card to the test taker and they ask them to make up a story about this card. So what is happening in this card, right? What is happening in this picture? What happened before this picture, right? What is happening now? What are the people feeling, right? What's going on? Kind of what are they thinking? And what do you think is going to happen afterwards, right? So you have to make up this story. So it's quite kind of you get a lot of material, right? People give you like a whole story, and if you give them 10 cards, you're going to hear 10 different stories. That's a lot of material. And so the test giver looks for these kind of recurring themes in these stories, right? So maybe in all of maybe if my wife just left me, right, I'm going to see in all of these stories something kind of sadness or rejection or something that would be kind of a recurring theme through my stories. Um, so, kind of these themes of feelings, of relationships, of kind of people's motives will give you an idea of kind of what kind of personality I have. If I am maybe a psychopath, then I'm going to see, like, oh, this guy's probably going to kill this old lady, right? He's standing there thinking, how is he going to kill her best, right? And she's standing there unsuspecting that he's about to stab her in the back, right? So that can tell you, right? If you heard this kind of response, that might kind of tell you something about what kind of personality I have, right? That this kind of story came into my mind. So again, of course, this is also very kind of ambiguous, right? I can interpret your responses in whichever way I can, right? So it's not very valid and reliable. This test was also criticized for eliciting mainly negative responses, even from happy and non-depressed people, right? So even though this is considered an ambiguous stimulus, this picture here that you see, I mean, they don't look happy, right? So, and it's a black and white picture. So automatically you kind of think more negatively than if you did if there was at least a colored picture, right? So this test kind of was criticized for being a bit more biased, for eliciting all of these kind of pathological responses. So projection tests in general, right, they're not very scientific, they're not very kind of reliable and valid, so they're mainly used by psychoanalysts, or they can be used in combination with other tests, right, to just kind of give you more material to work with, but you wouldn't just base your understanding of somebody's personality off of this one test alone, because it's way too kind of vague and non-specific, right? It's really open to interpretation. All right. So this is it. This is all I've got for you guys. So we'll have exam on Thursday. Definitely feel free to email me if you have any questions about this part of the lecture. If you wanted more kind of information about any of the concepts that we talked about. And if you did choose to do extra credit, upload it on Blackboard by next Tuesday. So that's April 4th, I believe. So by next Tuesday midnight, go ahead and upload it on Blackboard, and I will give you your 10 extra credit points. And then there's going to be another extra credit opportunity towards the end of the semester. So there's going to be 2. So this is one of them. All right. Well, I will see you all on Tuesday, and you guys have a good rest of your week.